Hi, this is the backup video for ancient and medieval history on Thursday, the 10th of September, in the year of our Lord 2020. Okay. So you all have open notebooks in front of you, something to write on, something to write with, and let's see. Yesterday, the A-Day, the people got to see the governor, who came in here on campus and visited this classroom. Of course, they didn't get a chance to say anything to him because it was all, imagine he's not here. Let him see what things are really like. He saw a good day of what things are really like. In any event, it was nice having him, and I hope you guys had a good experience watching online. Where we are in the lesson is I have given you some notion of what it was like to go through the shocking event where peacetime ends. Open notebook, please. And war begins. You can't imagine peacetime if you haven't experienced it. None of you have really experienced genuine peacetime. What I didn't tell you was, because I hadn't been wearing it, on Tuesday, September the 11th, 2001, I was wearing this tie. I'm a New Yorker originally. And New Yorkers, one of the strange things about us is that we have favorite buildings. My favorite building was the Empire State Building. In fact, as a kid, I hated the World Trade Center because it's so different. The Empire State Building is this beautiful Art Deco building from 1931. King Kong climbed it in the original movie. Then the Twin Towers were built, and there was these ugly gray, steel gray slabs. And in King Kong 1976, he climbed them, but it wasn't nearly as good a movie. But I was wearing this tie. If you look closely up here, you will notice the Twin Towers in the background. On the day that the towers were hit by those planes, I was wearing this tie. I have since only worn it when I teach this lesson, and I wore it for the graduation ceremony of the students who I was with on 9/11/2001. When they graduated from high school, I went to their graduation wearing this tie, and they got it. They understood. So I told you what happened to me, which isn't much. I wasn't there. My friends who worked in the World Trade Center, he had moved on. His company had moved on before the attacks that destroyed them. But they were brilliantly designed. And remember, it wasn't just the World Trade Center that was hit, it was also the biggest office building in the world, the Pentagon. So at this point, rather than go into the engineering directly like I did at the end of class yesterday, I'm going to pull back a little bit and talk about that morning itself and what the enemy did. So, in the year or two leading up to September 11th, operatives of the Al-Qaeda organization, Al-Qaeda meaning the base, came to the United States to learn how to fly airplanes. We let them into our flight schools because we have and had very generous policies towards people from around the world who want to go to our schools. But these people were less interested in learning how to land than is normal. They were interested in flying the plane in flight and targeting. They weren't so interested in takeoff. They really didn't care at all about landing. And this was witnessed because they were at several different schools around the country. On the night of September 10th to the 11th, the terrorists, the murderers, moved into position. I lived in Maine, and Mohammed Atef, the leader of these terrorists, and his partner came through from Canada through the Portland Jetport to Boston's Logan Airport, where he was going to board a plane. 19 hijackers gathered onto 4 transcontinental flights, 2 from Boston's Logan Airport, 2 from New York's John F. Kennedy Airport, JFK. And they were all going to the West Coast. What that means is that these were large jetliners filled with jet fuel, one of the most flammable substances known to man. The planes took off, and it was normal. for the first half hour or so. And then, at a prearranged time or on a prearranged signal, the terrorists took box cutters, which is basically a razor knife, an X-Acto knife. In a movie, they'd start threatening people. This wasn't a movie. They wanted to get people's attention right away. So they grabbed the hair of the person in front of them and slit their throats as an attention getter. Once they got the attention of the people, they moved everyone to the back of the plane. They then brought hostages to the pilot's cockpit, and they said, open the door or we're going to leave every hostage that we have. Now, at this point, all aircrew were trained in what to do in a hostage situation. What you do is at those times, you save lives. Because what they were expecting was what's called a hijacking. In a hijacking, you have some communist guerrillas, this happened a lot in the 70s and 80s, get on a plane and say, take this plane to Havana, which is Cuba, the capital of communist Cuba. And they would do so, and it would be about negotiating. Maybe one or two people would be killed in the initial takeover of the plane, but most people would live if basically things were done a certain way. So the flight crews opened up the cockpit and let the terrorists in. The terrorists yanked the flight crews out, sent them to the back of the plane too. Okay, they're going to fly the planes to wherever they want to go. That's what everyone assumed. All four of these planes then quickly dived under the radar. Radar only works above a certain height. Depending upon the radar is the height over the ground. Usually it's a few hundred feet for civilian radar. So the planes dived and changed course. Two of them headed to Washington, D.C. Two of them headed to New York City. The ones for New York City arrived first. One of them came down the long side of Manhattan Island at building top level in the Hudson, then went up over New Jersey, winged over, and dived, and hit the first tower right about here. A few minutes later, a second plane came in, also using the Hudson area space, and hit the second plane. Actually, around this back one over here, so that it blew out about this height on the other side. This was not about hijacking. It was not about negotiation. These planes were turned into massive kamikazes, human-piloted guided missiles. A jetliner that's cross-continent is bigger than any of the planes, most any of the planes I've ever seen at the Spokane airport. They're bigger because they got to go farther. You got a plane that can carry 500 passengers plus fuel to get you from Boston to Seattle, which is 3,000 and a couple hundred miles. You've got a plane that is diving at about the speed of sound. This is the proverbial irresistible force. It is in motion. It's going to remain in motion. And when the plane kissed the tower, they were meeting the proverbial unstoppable or immovable object. The laws of physics, as we understand them, broke down. The plane disintegrated, but shot its momentum and mass through the tower like a gunshot. So it would hit here, and it blew out a massive hole on the other side. Like a dum-dum bullet would do with the human skull. Dum-dum bullet makes a small hole going in, blows out half the skull on the way out. Everyone on the plane is dead, and everyone in the impact area, in the buildings and on the ground, where all the debris falls, is also dead. Right away. Gone. But each building survives its hit. Yamazaki, the architect who built the World Trade Center, built well. The outer walls were strong. They were rigid. There were holes in them, but the building held. It was not the impact of the planes that destroyed the buildings. The planes were filled with jet fuel, and hitting the buildings here at this altitude was the sweet spot. Because what happened is all the jet fuel that had atomized at the point of impact filled the area and was flaming. But the jet fuel didn't destroy the towers any more than the initial concussive impact destroyed the towers. No. The planners of this were brilliant architects who used their brilliance for evil. They counted on something. What are these skyscrapers really? What function do they serve? What do people do at work in these buildings? Does anyone want to guess?
They work. They do their jobs.
Are they factories?
No.
What kind of work?
They're office buildings.
They're office buildings. And office buildings have this. Massive quantities. And that is what the terrorists counted on. The massive quantities of paper that were ignited by that jet fuel that spewed out from that impact began burning hot. Now, you really can't properly fight a fire in any building taller than 20 stories. These buildings were 110 stories each. Again, at one time, tallest buildings on Earth. And so the plan is, if there's a fire somewhere in the middle, you evacuate from below the fire down the stairwells at the ground level. And you send in waves of helicopters to land on the roofs and pull everyone above the fire out. But as the helicopters, civilian and fire and official, began approaching the Twin Towers to try to bring people off the roof, the heat blooms off those buildings was so strong it was impossible to approach. No helicopter could get anywhere near the top of those buildings. The heat coming off of it turned the air into a churning maelstrom. It was impossible to fly. What that meant was that it hadn't happened yet, but everyone above the fire line was already dead. They just didn't know it yet. People who were below the fire line, many of them did escape. But as the buildings burned, firemen and police came into the buildings to try to rescue handicapped people, to try to rescue trapped people, led by high-ranking fire and police captains. The police ran towards the danger yet one more time. After about a half hour of burning, the terrorists' dream came true. Before that came true, the people who were roasting alive did what a normal person would do. They broke the windows, narrow windows, and scraped their way free to jump clear from the 109th floor. They injured themselves mightily because the windows are too narrow for a normal human being to pass through. And nobody's going to live from jumping from the 109th floor, but better to fall than be roasted alive or burned alive. There were several people who had cellular phones who said goodbye to their families. You can imagine what was said. And then it happens. The temperature and volume of the fire is so great that one of the metal walls buckles. Now remember, the World Trade Center is like an invertebrate. It has an exoskeleton. These walls are what holds up the floors. And when one of the walls buckled, it caused the floor to go, cement block went down and crushed everything below it. And that sent the floor below it down, down, down. And the entire tower collapsed, pancaking. Anyone who was still on that floor, those floors and still alive, were crushed to microscopic jelly. The police and fire and the surviving people trying to get out of the building down here had the buildings collapse directly onto them. Down, down, down. Happened to one building, fell into its cellar hole, happened to the second building. Precious little was left. There was a bit of the exoskeleton of the building left, but basically you've got these rubble piles because the buildings themselves disintegrated as they fell. Everyone died. In southern Manhattan, the air was so filled with particulate matter that massive increases in cancer and other rare respiratory diseases has been happening since then to anyone who happened to be there on that day and lived. Luckily, though, it was only around just before 9 o'clock in the morning. Had it been 2 hours later, the buildings would have been much closer to 5,000 people each. It was just under 3,000. Law enforcement and people in the buildings and the people on the planes that were killed. Just over 3,000. What about the other two planes? Well, one of them reaches Washington, D.C. airspace. Its target is going to be the White House. But I remember watching the news that morning. President Bush was in Florida, and his wife, Laura Bush, was a school librarian. That's what she did before she became First Lady. So he was part of her literary initiative, reading to elementary school kids, kindergartners, first graders. So he's sitting there reading stories, and the reports were of this. So the plane that was going to hit the White House wings over and circles Washington, D.C., looking for a target. And then they spot the biggest office building in the world. The Pentagon was built during World War II. It's for all 5 branches of our military: Coast Guard, Navy, Army, Marine Corps, Air Force. It has I think it's about 5 or 6 stories high. But it's got these massive wings that are, you've got a ring, then you've got another ring, then you've got another ring, and so it's just huge. And unlike the World Trade Center, which was made largely of fancy alloys and glass, the Pentagon is made of granite and steel and concrete with very little, with small windows. If you've ever played Fallout 3, you've seen what the Pentagon looks like. They do actually a pretty good job of displaying it there. Perhaps the terrorists had heard the legend that there is a nuclear power plant under the Pentagon, and if there was, it would spew radioactive waste and poison the Washington, D.C. area. So in any case, they dived at the Pentagon. They hit the Navy wing here in the outer rung. But it's the Pentagon. It's a wide building, not a tall building. It's made of granite and concrete and steel, not alloys and glass. They kill about 100, 150 people, injure a bunch more, but it's a much less damaging and dangerous event at the Pentagon. So that accounts for 3 of the 4 planes. What about the 4th one? Well, the 4th one is delayed. And over western Pennsylvania, people in the back who have cell phones are beginning to get reports of what's happened. This is not a hijack. This is not about taking the plane to Cuba. This is not about keeping the hostages alive. This is about using these aircraft as guided missiles against targets filled with civilians on the ground. The point was to pick the biggest target with the most civilians and do the most damage. People in the back of that flight decided that we better try to take control of the plane, and if we die, at least we die fighting. At least we die fighting. One of the last messages from that plane was a guy named Todd Beamer, who called his wife to say goodbye for the very last time. And the last word she heard from him was him shouting to rouse the crowd, "Let's roll." And they surged up towards the front of the plane. We don't know if they succeeded in getting control of the plane. What we do know is that plane nosedived into a farm field in western Pennsylvania. Everyone on board was killed, but the plane didn't kill anyone on the ground. They saved lives. Now, I'll tell you, at the time, I believed that the Air Force had shot the plane down to protect lives on the ground. And I would have been okay with it if it had. But as time has gone on and evidence has mounted, I do believe the story of the passengers rising up and at least taking control away from the terrorists. About the same number of people in the low 3,000s are killed on September 11th, 2001 as are killed at Pearl Harbor. But the Japanese Empire at least had the guts to pick a military target. The reason these guys are terrorists is their goal isn't to win a war by normal means. Their goal is to spread terror, because terror is a form of communication. If you can make your enemies afraid of you, your enemies will do what they want, what you want them to do. So they went out of their way to pick civilian-rich targets. There are people who like to equate our military with these terrorists, who forget, conveniently, that our military planes fly lower and slower to avoid hitting civilians, to target the corner of a building that has an anti-aircraft gun on it. When we move into a neighborhood, we don't follow the rules of war in 1945 and flatten a neighborhood with artillery and then send in tanks before we go in any room, deploy a grenade. We take extra risks to avoid civilian casualties. Sometimes they happen, but it's not because we are trying. We are trying to protect civilian life and win war. Our enemy is the opposite. Our enemy goes out of their way to find defenseless civilians as targets. So they kill 3,300 people in a very dramatic way. And this wakes us up to the reality that we are at war. And from that moment, we have been at war with radical Islam, Islamic terrorism. In 2001, before the end of the year, we had troops in Afghanistan to overthrow the Taliban, a fundamentalist Islamic government that was sheltering the Al-Qaeda organization. We came close to getting bin Laden, but we didn't, because we didn't have too many troops on the ground. We trusted our Afghani allies, which we had made fighting the Russians in the 1980s. Since then, we went into Iraq. The enemy has been engaged in bombing and other killings all around the world. And the state of peace that existed before that has not returned. Our enemies are supported by the communist government in China, by the Russian government indirectly, and by the Iranian government, the North Korean government, and to an extent, other Islamic governments much more directly. Every one of us is a target. Why? Some of us are anti-war. Not me, but some of you, no doubt. Wouldn't want us to be in Afghanistan fighting. Wouldn't want us to be in Iraq fighting. Would want us to try to make peace. You're all too young to have voted yet. And Islam is supposed to prevent war from harming women and children. So why are we all targets? Well, the Al-Qaeda handbook makes it clear. Every American civilian is a valid target in their war for two reasons. One, sooner or later they're going to pay taxes, which funds the American government that they hate. Two, all of us, to some extent or another, obey the law. And our obedience gives the American government power. As such, we're targets. Whether we're liberals or conservatives, progressives or libertarians, whether we're pro-war or anti-war, whether we know about this stuff or could care less about it, we are in a war on terror and we are targets. And as we go through the lessons, you will see where these targetings happen. Any questions or comments so far? So you might ask yourself validly, why? Why do they hate us so? Why did this happen? They didn't just pick us out of a random hat. They chose to fight us. To truly understand the answer, we have to go back almost 4,000 years to the world's very first civilization, the civilization of Sumer, the city of Ur. There's a group of nomads outside of one of the first cities ever built by people. These are shepherds. And the leader of the family of shepherds is named Abram. And Abram has a wife named Sarai, and he's got extended family. He's got a brother who lives in town. And everyone in this clan, a couple hundred people, owe allegiance to Abraham. He has servants and slaves, too. And one day, Abram comes home from work and sits down in his tent and says, "You won't believe what happened. Most amazing thing happened to me." They say, "What, Abram?" And he says, "God spoke to me." And they say, "Right, God. Which God? Was it the goddess of love? Was it the god of gambling? It wasn't the god of war or the god of pestilence, right?" And Abram says, No, you don't understand. God, singular, one and only, talked to me. To which they responded, "Right." See, the ancients couldn't wrap their brain around the notion that the same God who made first love's first kiss put snakes in the grass and gave disease to people. To the ancient mind, the pagan mind, it was much more likely that the world is beset by many different divine beings, some of which are friendly to people, some of which are hostile, and some of which could care less and we better stay the heck out of their way. The idea of there being one God, omniscient and omnipotent, is just ludicrous. So Abram begins to make himself obnoxious because he won't stop talking about this God, singular stuff. You may want to write these words down. Omniscient. 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 And then the other word, omnipotent. 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 You may want to write them down. To your choice. Omniscient means all-knowing. Yes?
I was going to say omniscient means all-knowing, omnipotent means all-powerful.
Hoorah. Absolutely right. Omniscient. Science is knowledge. That's where the word science comes from. Scient, science. All-knowing, omnipotent, all-powerful. In other words, there's nothing that God doesn't understand, and there's nothing that God can't do. So he is all-knowing, all-powerful, singular, and a person. And God speaks to Abraham, and Abraham speaks to the people, and some of the people are interested, and some of the people say, "Get the heck out of here, you crazy lunatic." So Abram leaves, and he takes his people into the wilderness to a land that God has promised. But traveling in those days is not like taking a road trip today. There's no highway, there's no comfy automobile, there are no rest areas, there are no restaurants. You're walking through the desert with your flocks, hoping you find grass for them to eat, hoping that you find fresh water for them to drink, hoping that bandits don't come along and steal your flocks from you, steal your women from you, or kill you. Or all of that rolled up into one, hoping you don't encounter disease, locusts, and all the other fun things that can happen out in the world. Don't even ask Abram if we're there yet. Because Abram has made it clear, God will let me know when we've arrived. So he doesn't know when they're going to arrive. He doesn't know where they're going. He just knows God will show him when he gets there. Think about the faith that involves. Abram has to trust that God will guide him. He's putting all the people that are in his care on the line. Those people who are following Abram are choosing loyalty to a man who is beset by this vision that nobody else really understands, the singular God, all-knowing, all-powerful. Really doesn't make sense. But they go along because of trust, loyalty, love, obligation, faith. They cross the Fertile Crescent. from what is now Iraq to what is now Syria to what is now Lebanon, and then south into what is now Israel. And Israel, what isn't called Israel yet, is called the land of Canaan. Canaanites live there. And God says to Abram, come up to this hilltop, look around. All of this will be yours. You will be the father of a great nation. And Abram says to himself, thank you, God, but I see all this land and it's all occupied by enemies. They're not going to just give it over. And as to being the father of a nation, I'm in my 80s or 90s. My wife is in her 80s and 90s. She's been through menopause, which means she's no longer of breeding age. How am I going to be the father of anything? We don't have any kids. God says, you're going to trust me? Abram says, okay. Somehow it'll happen. So they settle on the fringes of life in the land of Canaan. At first, Abram says, maybe I'm not supposed to have a child with my wife. Maybe I can have it with this slave girl. So he has relations with a slave girl, and there is a son, Ishmael. But it's clear that God is not favoring Ishmael. And Sarai, the wife, hates Ishmael and hates the mother, the slave girl, who thinks that she's an equal now because the master slept with her and had a child with her. And the old Sarai couldn't have a child of her own. Eventually, Abram and Sarai, even though biologically she shouldn't be able to have kids, they have a son, Isaac. And Isaac becomes the center of the world. He is the proof of faith. God has sent him a miracle, a son. Abram has a son. His wife has a son. They shouldn't be able to have had a kid, but they did. So Isaac is the apple of his eye. And then one day when Isaac's 6 or 7 years old, Abram says, take the kid, come to the holy mountain, go to the flat stone that looks like a table, and bring a really sharp knife. Abram says, okay. So he gets the knife, he gets his son, goes to the hill, up the hill, to the flat mountain, to the flat rock. And Isaac's like, we're going to see the stars, Daddy. And Abram says, sure. And when they get to the rock near the top, God says to Abram, okay, have the boy lay down on the table. Have him lay down on the flat rock. Abram's not liking where this is going, but he has the boy lay down. The boy completely trusts his father. And then God says, sacrifice him to me. Demonstrate your love and your loyalty. Bleed your son. Kill him. Do it now. Abram gave up his life, took his whole world into the wilderness, threw everyone's life into chaos, out of faith in a God that just asked him to kill the one thing in the world that he loved more than anything else. The gift God gave him. He takes the knife, places it in his hand, and begins to strike, and God says, stop! Take that knife, put it away, send the boy off to play. We need to talk. Abram is in shock. He was in the process of killing his only legitimate son. So the boy, thank you, Daddy, we'll go play. Abram is there, and God says, you have done something absolutely clear. You've proven your loyalty to me above all other things. I know that you love the boy more than anything else in the world. The question is, were you loyal to God above all things? You proved that you were. We will have a covenant. C-O-V-E-N-A-N-T. It should be in your notes. Covenant. And the covenant is an agreement between God and man. We're on page 2. The covenant is an agreement between God and man, where God promises to teach and guide and lead, and where the human beings promise to learn and be loyal and follow. So that is the covenant. We're at 2000 BC to 1800 BC. The third eye, we've done Abram, we've done three great monotheists, and we're doing the covenant right now. It is the contract between God and man, where God promises to lead and teach, and where man promises to learn and obey. That's the covenant. God gives Abram a new name, Abraham. His wife a new name, Sarah, not Sarai, Sarah, to represent the new lives that they have in the covenant. The agreement, where God promises to teach and where man promises to learn, where God leads and man follows. Yeah.
I didn't get
Come on up. Here you go. Gotta keep my mouth closed. Okay. Why was it necessary to go through that? Because what was wanted was a human being who was completely loyal. And from that complete fidelity, that faithfulness, that loyalty, would come the three great monotheistic faiths. Monotheism is the belief in one God. Monotheos, theos being God, mono being one. Monotheism is the belief in one God, omniscient, omnipotent, all-knowing, all-powerful God, Lord God Almighty. Polytheism is not the belief in some parrot. It's the belief in many gods, poly being many. So, polytheism, polytheos, many gods, and that's what paganism is. It is the belief in a god of war, a god of death, a god of secrets, a goddess of love, a goddess of whatever. The three great monotheistic faiths all worship the same God. Theologically, that's clear. But they understand that God very differently. So what are these three great monotheistic faiths? Yeah.
Judaism, Islam, and Christianity.
Yes, I'll do it in chronological order. Judaism, which is the Jewish faith, Christianity, which is the Christian faith, and Islam, which is the Muslim faith. So those are the three great monotheistic faiths: the Jewish faith, the Christian faith, the Islamic faith. Those terrorists who blew up those buildings believed that they worshipped the same God as the Jews and Christians and Muslims that were in that building. But they had a different understanding of what worship meant. We're going to talk about how we get from there to here. So with Abram, we have the covenant, we have an established agreement between the children of Abraham, who are going to become the Hebrews, the Israelites, and God. And that is the basis. There are then many stories, and we move ahead to a time when drought and suffering bring the Israelites, the children of Abraham, into the land of the empire of Egypt. Egypt, because of the Nile, has incredibly fertile soil and rarely suffers from the same kind of drought and famine that other regions do. So, being migratory herdsmen, the Hebrews go to Egypt and they ask Pharaoh for permission to settle there. And the Pharaoh says yes. I could go into stories of why. I don't have time. But the Hebrews are used to freedom. They're used to the freedom a shepherd has to come and go as he likes. The peasants of Egypt are commanded by the Pharaoh in everything. And the Israelites call them slaves. And they call the life that they now have in Egypt slavery. The Hebrews are owned by the Pharaoh, like all other Egyptians. The Hebrews are going to work in the fields for the Pharaoh, growing food, growing straw, making bricks, all that stuff. They are going to be the labor force that builds the great works of Egypt. This is New Kingdom Egypt. It's not pyramids anymore, but it's still Egypt. Glorious, glorious Egypt. And they consider it slavery, and they have good reasons. But the Egyptians are afraid that the Hebrews are breeding in massive numbers and that they're going to be a threat. And the Hebrews settle along the eastern border with the Sinai Peninsula. If an enemy came from Syria or from the land of Canaan, would the Israelites fight for Egypt or would they fight for the invader? So the Egyptian leadership became nervous. And plus, these guys, they don't assimilate, they don't blend in. When you come to America, we expect that you or your kids are going to learn English. We expect that you or your kids are going to go to American schools and that you are going to get a job and be part of us. We assume that if you come to America, you're coming to be an American. Those people who don't assimilate, who don't blend in, do not have a good time. That's true for any immigrant group in almost any country. The Hebrews don't blend in. They don't worship the gods of Egypt. They don't show any intention of worshiping the gods of Egypt. They worship the one desert god that Abram worships. They don't even have a name for him. So they stand apart, and they seem dangerous to the Egyptians. So Pharaoh makes a decision. There's a legend of a deliverer that God will send to the Hebrews to lead them into freedom. And he's born under a certain sign. And the high priests of Egypt say the sign has happened. So Pharaoh orders the death of the firstborn. He orders the death of the firstborn sons of Israel. The Egyptian army goes into Goshen, where the Israelite slaves are, and kills every small boy they can, especially the firstborn. But they're not too particular. However, there is a family of Hebrews, Amram and Yoshabel, that guy and a gal, and they have kids. And they have a baby boy at around the right time. So they have their daughter, I think her name is Miriam. They have her daughter take the little baby quietly to the Nile River, put it in a basket, wrapped up, swaddling cloths and diapers, and let it go. Let it go. Because maybe the baby will get killed by a Nile crocodile. Maybe the baby will get killed by an eagle. Maybe the baby will be drowned as the basket sinks. Maybe the baby will be killed any number of ways. But if the baby stays here, it will die. 100% chance. On the Nile, the baby has a chance. But Miriam follows the thing, the basket with the baby in it. And one of Pharaoh's daughters is having a ceremony with her maidservants by the river, and she has just lost a baby. In fact, she thinks she's infertile. And she notices this weird basket floating down the shore of the Nile River, and she goes out personally, risking crocodiles and everything else, and she discovers it's a little baby. And she claims it as her own. She calls the baby Moses, which means gift of the river. And raises the child as a prince of Egypt. So here we have a Hebrew who is sent to his real mother to nurse, because the princess of Egypt can't nurse, and Miriam is close by. So we have Moses, the baby, being nursed by his real mother, who doesn't claim Moses as her son, because Moses, even though he is her son, is claimed by the princess of Egypt and is protected, therefore, by Egyptian law. And he, unlike any Hebrew, is going to learn Egyptian education, royalty. He's going to learn engineering, he's going to learn math, literature, he's going to learn religion, he's going to learn military arts, he's going to learn how to lead people, he's going to learn all this stuff. And he does. And that, I think, is where we're going to leave things for today. Moses is a prince of Egypt. Any questions, comments, or thoughts? What video? No, obsession is what we're going to see at the end of the lectures. Okay? Yes?
I enjoy studying Greek mythology, and it's much like what happened with Rhea and Zeus. He sent her son away in order to chance.
Indeed. No, there are some interesting commonalities among the religions that come out of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East. The flood thing is a big deal too, which you'll see in the opposed view. But yeah, it's good stuff. Okay, so where did we get? We got to Prince of Egypt. So tomorrow I'll lecture on video. There may be a few film clips I'll show and have you look at, and so forth. What is due next for you guys? What's due next for ancient? Let's see. That's here we are. Okay, week 3, creation myths. That's Monday, September 14th. Oh, yeah, that's next week. So, what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to change the due date to Wednesday, September 16th, and Thursday, September 17th. Wednesday, 9/16, write this down, and Thursday, 9/17. And the reason for that is I want to give you a little bit more time to get the creation myth ready. We're not going to talk about the creation myths for a while, but I want you to have it done. And if you have it done, then you don't have to worry about doing it. You can focus on Chapter Survey 1, which you should also be working on. By the way, fair warning. Chapter Survey 1, I've given you a few weeks to work on in addition to other things. Chapter Survey 2 is due 1 week later. So you're going to have to do the entire chapter survey in 1 week. So be prepared for that. I see no other questions or comments unless you have one. Is that a hand up or no? No. Okay. So you can, yes?
Is our creation myth when we present that, is it like just more like...
I'm going to grade what you say.
Okay.
So what I'm going to suggest is that you be ready to go next Wednesday or Thursday, but I'm not going to have you go next Wednesday or Thursday. The reason for that is that you're going to be doing your creation myth presentation after we are finished with terrorism, which includes being finished with the Obsession movie, and after we take a quiz on it. So it could be 2 or 3 weeks until we do the creation myths. But if you're ready for next week, you can just have your notes and be ready to go. It is wiser for you to do that. If you are unwise and you wait until I say, okay, tomorrow you're going to start presenting your myths, you will be in big trouble because you will be beset by a bunch of other history assignments at the same time. That's why I'm having you do it early. Does that make sense? Okay. You may talk quietly among yourselves until I'll dismiss.
We get to go outside for lunch.
Yes, you do.
Yeah, it's pretty good. It's sad, but really...
I've got to stop my video.
So it's about this story. So this woman is taking her son one day, but she's taking her
See ya.